Well, he was so advanced, even in his own day, that he often had trouble getting recognition, even in his very earliest songs. And his first Broadway show was 1903. He was using things such as enharmonic modulation, which to the average listener sounds like an abrupt change of key in the middle of a song. And they were virtually unheard of in popular songs of those days. But Kern was significant for three things. First of all, in 1914, he interpolated several numbers into an English show that was brought to New York. And in those days, almost all your shows were English shows. And American composers got their start by interpolating a few additional tunes into them. Well, this was an English show with the odd title of The Girl from Utah. And he had about 5 or 6 songs in the show, one of which was They Didn't Believe Me. And every major surviving composer that I've spoken to credits that song with starting the vogue for the popular ballad as we know it today. Before that, the hit song of every show was a waltz. Think of The Merry Widow or A Waltz Dream or almost any show you want to name, and it was almost always a three-quarter piece. Then in 1915, along with Guy Bolton and a year later with P.G. Wodehouse, he brought musical comedy into the 20th century with the Princess Theater shows. Up until then, musical comedy had been very loosely knit frippery. Bolton writing the libretto, Wodehouse doing the lyrics, and Kern doing the music, brought together stories about realistic people in plausible, though unlikely, situations. They made these songs pertain to the story and move the story on. And the lyrics, and the dialogue indeed, were both literate and witty, something that was very rare. And lastly, perhaps most significantly, he created purely American operetta, even though we don't call it operetta. Somehow operetta has become a dirty word. But with Showboat, he created an operetta totally in the American idiom. It was set in America, it dealt with American types, had American philosophy, and all through it, the music is idiomatically American from beginning to end.
Kern was a very American composer, but he had a strange mixture. Born in New York, brought up in Newark, went to Germany to study, then back to England.
Right.
Why was that all necessary?
Well, it was virtually impossible for an American composer to have a hearing on Broadway at the turn of the century. Broadway musical comedy was dominated by importations, most notably the George Edwards Gaiety shows. And Kern got his reputation ultimately by crossing back and forth till he was as respected in England as he was in America. But, of course, Kern had a mixed heritage. His father was a German, and though his mother was American-born, she had Bohemian roots. So that Kern was brought up with Bohemian music, German music, and, of course, with American music. And it remained for Kern to modernize Broadway theater music. What you had until then was the sort of French and Austrian operetta style that Victor Herbert exemplified for American audiences. And that, of course, we had heard originally from Offenbach, from Sullivan, from Strauss and Milliker. And then, of course, you also had the music hall type, which you got quite often in the Gaiety shows. But it was Kern who slowly started to bring American influences in. For example, in 1915, the first Princess Theater show had a song called The Magic Melody, which was the first Broadway musical number to introduce blues harmonies. 2 years before, Kern had insisted that his orchestrator, Frank Sadler, bring the saxophone, a jazz instrument essentially, into the orchestra pit. He was constantly moving away from European mannerisms and bringing in native American mannerisms.
And breaking a lot of rules along the way.
Yes, constantly.
Do we have any examples of this from his early work that we could perhaps play? something?
Well, I think the best song would be the one I was just talking to, the Magic Melody from Nobody Home. And it's a fascinating song. It won't sound like much today because we're so used to it. Except if you go back before it, you find no other examples where they've used those blues harmonies.
When the Showboat arrives, that marvelous background music with the tambourines and everything, that always fascinates me. What is the progression there? Yes.
I don't know if you're aware of something. Just try to sing that backwards. It's Old Man River.
Oh, yes, of course.
He was playing with themes constantly. Captain Andy's theme, for example, recurs in all sorts of variations through that. He was approaching, really, American opera. Certainly American operetta. There are many things about Showboat that are, for example, there are many scenes that are never performed anymore. The Te Deum scene, which is almost pure opera.
The movie Swing Time, I recently saw at Radio City Music Hall here, and the whole film fits together, the music and everything. You can't imagine that film without that music.
Well, it's very interesting because there were lots of problems with that. First of all, he could not write the title song, or almost the title song, Waltz and Swing Time. He could not quite grasp what Fred Astaire wanted. And so he created a number of melodies and gave them to Robert Russell Bennett and said, put them together any way Fred wants. And if you'll notice, Kern was a very honest man, a extremely honest person. And he, in the published sheet music, and remember he owned the publishing house, said, written, words to this effect anyway, written by Robert Russell Bennett from themes of Jerome Kern. And of course, there's another number in there, Pick Yourself Up, which is not Kern at all. It's an old Bohemian folk song that was used in a number of Bohemian classical pieces as well.
Yes, it's almost a clog dance. You can hear it going slap,
but
slap,
it's
slap.
in Schwanda the Bagpipe Player. It's been used by so many people, Smetana, and you'll find it in a number of Czechoslovakian compositions.
Was it possible to get close to Mr. Kern, talking to people, talking to friends and associates?
Yes, except he had very few friends in the theater. He felt most theater people were phonies, and most of his friends were outside of the theater. Those people who were his friends loved him because he was an extremely witty and extremely charming, very considerate and very generous man, away from business. Almost everybody I talked to who dealt with him in business had nothing nice to say about him, or little nice, because he could be brutal. There was a marvelous story that one producer told me of Kern sitting there trying to bleed the last penny out of him, and then suddenly a telephone call came that the producer's mother had been rushed to the hospital. Kern immediately became solicitous, insisted that he drive the man to the hospital, stayed there all through the emergency with the man. When it was all over, they went back to the office, and he said it was like pushing a button. Kern became an icicle again.
Howard Dietz is in there as well, isn't he?
For one show, and they did not get along. I don't know if this is out of school telling this story. It's a story I could not use in the book because I couldn't record it. He's a very, very sick man, and his voice was so weak that I couldn't pick it up on my tape recorder. I said to him, I don't want to trouble you too much because I know you're having difficulty speaking. Could you, in one word, sum Jerome Kern up for me? And his one word was money mad. And that was really his recollection of their whole relationship.
Do you think that's fair?
Yes. Charming and delightful as Jerome Kern obviously was with his friends, the stories I got from everyone was that he was, almost vicious when it came to money matters.
But then he took so many risks with his work.
Oh, yes.
You'd think that somebody after money wouldn't dare do that.
No, I think he just knew his merit. Artistically, no one questioned him. Some people may not consider him the greatest. Some people may take Gershwin or Richard Rodgers. But no one questions his importance or his artistic integrity. It's just that when he was having business dealings, he was downright mean.
There were other good things he did in Hollywood. The film of Roberta is
Right.
a good example.
Right. Of course, most of that music was written for the show. And one of the great songs from it was written for another show, a London show that failed, called The Three Sisters. That was I Won't Dance. But there was very little music that was original written for that, except for one great tune that brought Kern together with his own personal favorite lyricist, Dorothy Fields.
Which is that?
Lovely to Look At. Which was a perfect song because Dorothy Fields had to get up a lyric that would both be a love song and yet be right for a fashion show. And as you go over those lyrics, they just fit to a T. He did Cover Girl, which has one of his great masterpieces, Long Ago, or as most people know it, Long Ago and Far Away, Centennial Summer, High, Wide, and Handsome. You can go on and on. So many marvelous films.
There's one image from Cover Girl of Rita Hayworth running down the
those
ramp.
stairs. I think it's one everybody remembers.
Yes.
Right.
What was the background to that?
It's been years.
I forget the name.
Years
of it.
since I've seen the
I
film.
remember,
I don't remember.
you could see all the chorus boys were slightly out of step because it was made during the war and it was hard to get chorus boys in.
There were lots of problems with that. They had to move from place to place quite often when they were filming. Gene Kelly told me the marvelous story. It's in the book. They would mouth the songs and then record them later. And when he came to do Long Ago and Far Away, Kern was sitting there very sternly watching. And Kelly said to me that he became more and more nervous as he watched Kern watch him without a sign of emotion. And finally, when the recording session was all over, Kelly walked out and said, "Look, Mr. Kern, if you feel I've done something wrong, I'll do it all over for you." And Kern smiled and said, "No, my boy, it was just marvelous." That was it. But you often couldn't tell what Kern thought. He would just sit there immovable.
His music fitted so many almost untrained voices, but still they were distinctive. Gene Kelly,
Right.
Fred Astaire.
Well, Fred Astaire was his favorite performer, and even as early as 1917, in what was, of course, a publicity release, but I still think had more than a kernel of truth, he said he would rather have people who can bring the lyric over and bring the emotion of a song over than bring over the melody. He felt his melody would take care of itself. And a number of his shows in the 20s were criticized because of the poor singing. But he was more interested in getting a good actor, a good performer for the role, than a truly fine singer who might be stiff on stage.
Smoke Gets in Your Eyes fascinates me. And there's a strange break in the middle of that song. What happens
Well,
there?
it's a peculiar story. It was originally written as a soft shoe for Showboat. Yump, bum, ba-bum, ba-bum. It was dropped, and then Kern rewrote it as a march to be the theme song of a radio series of written-to-order musicals for radio that never got on the air.
I can't imagine there's a march.
Bum, bum, ba-bum, ba-bum,
Oh, yes,
bum,
yes.
ba-bum. That was discarded. One day when Otto Harbach and Kern were working on Roberta, Harbach happened to notice the sheet music there, and he could read music. He said, "Why don't we use this?" And Kern just waved it away. And Harbach said, "Play it very slowly and gently." And Kern did, and he said, "Forget it." And Harbach said, "Oh, no, let me have it." And Harbach turned it into the great song that it is today. Kern thereafter was furious with Harbach if he ever brought it up. He didn't want people to know that he had missed, that he himself couldn't have spotted that in his own song. That is not quite typical of his personality. That was just a quirky incident, but it was interesting.
The lyrics are almost too literal. The lyrics are almost too good in my mind for Harbach, so I chaffed them and I gaily laughed to think they could doubt my laugh.
I find that funny. I think they're dreadful. And I think...
Yes, they're almost pretentious.
Yes, right, exactly. And, of course, people talk differently in those days, but I'm not sure they talked that differently. Patterns change. Lyrics that sounded natural in their own day sound artificial, and I'm sure we'll see that with Sondheim's lyrics in 50 years.
Still, a good singer can get away with it.
Oh, yes, yes. Well, the melody will carry it.
I became more and more interested in Mr. Kern as I read your book. But, say you were trying to get somebody interested in the works of Jerome Kern. Briefly, how would you do that?
I would say this, and it may sound very strange and almost the wrong terminology for a man to use. I can think of no other composer whose music, the more I hear it, still makes me want to swoon. It's a body of music that you never tire of. In fact, the more you hear it, the more it grows on you. And I would assume if you have any appreciation of musical values and musical history, this man would have to be your man as far as American popular music goes.
Should note we're filming
16th,
tomorrow, 16th, right. Mr. Bordman, I must admit I had trouble with this man when I first started looking into his work, and your book helped a great deal. And I asked people, name some music. Why don't we know as much as we should about him?
Well, it's very strange. I think perhaps if you were raised in America, you would know more about him, because until the advent of rock and roll, he was one of the most popular American composers, even on the radio, as late as the late 50s and early 60s. But of course, as you know, and I'm sure it's true in Australia as well as here, rock and roll just pushed everything aside. Even towering giants such as Richard Rodgers or Irving Berlin could not get shows on Broadway thereafter. Or if they did, they had very bad luck with them. But Jerome Kern is generally considered one of the three giants of American music. And certainly among those three giants, and they would be Victor Herbert and Kern and Richard Rodgers, he is the most significant because more than anybody, he changed American musical theater styles and made them what they are today.
Yes, he spanned the whole range of musical comedy, operetta, everything. And he goes right back, doesn't he? He sounds modern to us, but he did start fairly early. Yes, I find that a lot of people regard Oklahoma as being the first show to have done this, but it wasn't.
Oh, no, no, of course not. In fact, you can make a very strong argument that all of Gilbert and Sullivan was beautifully integrated. Musical comedy tended to be less well integrated than comic opera or operetta. And it was really the Princess Theater shows that Kern and Bolton and Woodhouse did that fully integrated musical comedy, as opposed to operetta.
What's that marvelous photograph you have in your book of the chorus girls in the front line, and then they double up at the back to hide the fact that there aren't many men in the production?
Well, of course, in those days, musicals were written not to assail audiences the way they are today, but to assuage the tired businessman. And there was nothing the tired businessman wanted to see more than beautiful women, with the result that chorus girls always dominated. There were usually 2 or 3 times as many chorus girls as you had chorus boys.
Was it considered a bit light for a man to go into this sort of work, or what?
No. It was simply that they knew the trade they were catering to. The women came to see the beautiful girls beautifully dressed and learn something about fashions. The men came just to ogle the girls. I guess in those days, a woman could not admit publicly that she'd like to keep her eyes on a beautiful man all evening.
Yes, and vice versa. The actress was considered rather risqué and a little naughty. She could get away with things that many other women couldn't. Well,
that was certainly true of the soubrettes. It wasn't always true of the leading ladies, though if you take Jerome Kern's Oh Boy, which was one of the Princess Theater shows, the heroine, and this was one of the first times it happened, the heroine was a genuine bitch. but it was softened enough so that it was palatable to the audiences at that time. I'm sure if they wrote it today, she would be an out-and-out bitch. But in 1917, there were just little clues when she tries to redecorate the hero's house, for example, that sort of thing. You can go through any of his older songs, and we mentioned earlier enharmonic modulations. They were not commonplace in earlier shows.
Fine. Would we be able to get a copy of that? No, this is out. Would we?
Yes, sure.
Oh, lovely. Okay, fine.
The one thing you might want to mention is we've mentioned his two of his three most significant contributions. We hadn't mentioned the last one.
Which?
He pioneered American operetta with Showboat, what they call American musical play.
Right. Mm-hmm. Right. That was, what was the piece of music we just played?
The music?
Yes, the one you introduced.
You mean the Magic Melody?
The Magic Melody, right. That was the Magic Melody by Jerome Kern, and I'm talking to Gerald Bordman in New York about his book, Jerome Kern, and about the man. He made many contributions to the American musical theatre, didn't he?
Right. He initiated, popularized the modern ballad, brought musical comedy into the 20th century, as we've said.
Yes, there's that. Why does... Yes, and if I remember the MGM version, the film version, it segues from that theme into make-believe,
right,
which is a natural progression. Was it written as that?
I don't really recall now. I'd have to go back and look. Showboat has been presented so many ways now that you almost have to go back to look at the original score. I don't think any version, any revival has been truly faithful, even the one that Kern supervised in '32. It would be interesting. In fact, I do believe the Smithsonian did, not the original version, but all the material ever written for Showboat. But it might be interesting to actually try Showboat as originally done.
Helen Morgan fascinates me. It seems that her voice was made for Kern. How did that all fit together?
Well, he spotted her in a show and realized that she would be perfect for Julie and wrote the music for Julie, for her.
Well, to her range.
Yes, exactly. And then, of course, as you know, wrote an entire show for her afterwards, a beautiful show called Sweet Adeline. And then, of course, the Depression came, and she sort of disappeared from the scene, and within a few years he was in Hollywood, so nothing else followed.
Let's talk about the Hollywood phase. There's some lovely stuff from there.
Marvelous material.
You mentioned in your book that Mr. Bennett didn't socialize with Mr. Kern, that they were worlds apart, yet they worked together well.
Well, they didn't not socialize either. There was no close friendship. Obviously, when they were on tour, trying out a show, they would play bridge together, as Mr. Bennett told me. But there was never any close camaraderie.
Incredible. Back to Hollywood.
Right.
Of course, it's become the corny fashion show number ever since.
Right.
What else do you do in Hollywood? I've lost track here.
He did a great many pictures. He did a beautiful score for something called Stolen Dreams, which was never released. And someday, perhaps, some of that music will be heard by the public. It's gorgeous music.
In your book, you analyze his music to a degree that the standard reader like myself can follow you. You go through.
I hope so. It was also to the degree that some critics said was overkill, but.
No, you go through his progressions, and you explain to me why some of Jerome Kern's music fascinates me. I don't have much musical background. Is this indicative of his work, that he took formulas and destroyed them?
Yes,
but he did,
all the way through.
But did he do it to a pattern, his own pattern?
Well, obviously there were characteristics that developed, a love of triplets. And I think probably at times the enharmonic modulations we've been talking about were used just to show that he could do it. Nonetheless, he did constantly pioneer, whether it was blues harmonies or the ballad form or trying to get an operetta effect with American musical idioms.
Would you say there was a turning point in his career where he went from just a good writer to a splendid, above-average writer?
Yes. About the time of the First World War, when he suddenly broke through not only with They Didn't Believe Me and the Princess Theater shows, but he really found himself with one show. It was a failure called 90 in the Shade. It came out just after The Girl from Utah. And virtually every song from that show was salvaged and used again importantly somewhere else. And that was where he found his first great style. He had a number of great styles. The Princess Theater style, which was dance-based. Then later a more arioso style, exemplified by Showboat or Music in the Air or The Cat and the Fiddle. And
where does Sally fit in there?
Sally was just glorious musical comedy, made all the more glorious by Ziegfeld. It was originally conceived as a very intimate Princess Theater show called The Little Thing. And it was Ziegfeld who elaborated it and turned it into the spectacle it became.
I'm sorry I interrupted you. You were talking marvelously about styles then.
Well, he had one other style, and that's the most peculiar one of all to me, and that's the Hollywood style, where he seems almost to have gone to a Tin Pan Alley tradition.
Yes, he went...
But to have just done it better than anybody else.
He went brassy in the nice sense.
Exactly, precisely. So there are those three, the Princess Theater musical comedy tradition, the Showboat operetta tradition, and the Hollywood, let's call it the Hollywood tradition and let it go at that.
He was one of the few good talents that survived in Hollywood. How did he do that?
By not caring. He called that his Orange Grove period. And he just went out there and had a good time, and because of his name got fabulous contracts. Then, of course, also something else happened. He became very, very ill 3 years after he moved out there and nearly died. And thereafter, his whole attitude towards life was almost a sort of carpe diem attitude. And even though he still wrote magnificent music, constantly experimented, as we see with All the Things You Are, nonetheless, he just really was out to enjoy himself, and he did tremendously. His daughter tells me that her mother knew he was on the road to recovery after that terrible attack in '37 when she walked into the bedroom and heard him on the phone with his bookie, betting on horses.
What was the attack? What was the illness?
It seemed to have been a cerebral attack that may have been complicated, they're not sure, by a mild heart attack, that one may have brought the other on. But they did not expect him to live initially, and he did. He pulled through.
He died right at the end of World War II.
Yes, indeed he did. He had decided he had it with Hollywood, and he was going back to Broadway for 2 poets. He was going to revive Showboat, and having gotten his hand, the feel of Broadway again, with Showboat, he was going to do the music for a show that was then called Annie Oakley. And he had just gotten to New York. He'd only been here about 3 or 4 days, and was going to do some antique shopping, and was standing on the corner of 57th Street and Park Avenue, and just collapsed. He was rushed to Welfare Island because nobody realized who he was. He was put in a ward with all the derelicts. Somebody spotted his ASCAP button, called ASCAP, and they identified him. Oscar Hammerstein ran over there and brought him back to Doctor's Hospital. But there was nothing they could do. He came out of the coma a few times, but from the beginnings, the doctors knew there was no hope.
How old was he?
He was only 60. He probably still had some of his greatest songs ahead of him. Of course, one will never know.
How big a catalogue is it? It must be huge.
Well, there are 900 published songs, and I have many, many more that were never published, some of which are gorgeous.
What, you got that from relatives?
From relatives, from the various publishers who were kind enough to let me use it for study purposes.
What sparked your interest in the man?
Well, I just feel he's the greatest of all the American composers. And my first book covered all the musicals ever done on Broadway from 1767 right up to 1978 when the book came out. And a number of times in the book, I mentioned that I felt that Kern was the greatest of American composers, certainly the most important. And Oxford asked me to do a biography because of that.
And you're coming up with another one on Vincent Youmans.
Yes, that'll be
similar background, both wealthy, Jewish.
Oh no, Youmans was not Jewish. Youmans was very much the WASP, an old American family, upper class. Next to Cole Porter, he was by far the wealthiest.
That shows you how much I know about Vincent Youmans, which probably reflects what most people know about Vincent Youmans.
He was once denied admission to the Metropolitan Club because a member blackballed him on the grounds that he was Jewish. And no argument could convince that member that a Broadway composer wasn't a Jew. But no, his father there was until the until the mid-20s, a very famous hatter here in New York, Youmans, and that was the family. And
but before we go too much further, that's a book we have to look forward to
later on.
Right,
yeah.
Back to Mr. Kern.
Right.
It was a terrible loss when he went, wasn't it?
Yes. Peculiar thing, though. I've often wondered what sort of music he would have written for Annie Oakley, which is, I'm sure you realize, became Annie Get Your Gun with Irving Berlin music, because Kern had a criterion. He said he would never do music for a show that did not have the odor of sachet. Now, I cannot see any show with Ethel Merman having the odor of sachet, and I've often wondered what would have happened. I think in one respect, it's lucky that Irving Berlin did the music. I just cannot see Kern doing Ethel Merman's type of music.
Yes, I often wonder what would have happened to Gypsy with somebody else, right, or many of the shows that Merman did.
Well, you know, Kern was originally supposed to do Porgy, but to do it with Al Jolson, of all people, and it fell through. So there are a great many shows in that realm of might-have-beens that probably we're lucky never were.
Did you have trouble getting through to the man? Is there much there that you can tap into?
Yes, I think so. I think on a social basis he must have been an utterly delightful person. But he was very picky and choosy on who he would like socially. In the case of his business relationships, he was very tough, downright mean, many people said. But at the same time, he gave you value.
And you can see when it goes through, boom, boom, right. Back up to level again.
Right.
Yes, I've let our bloody coffee get cold, but we'll finish in a second. Did he have any favourites? Which of his songs do you think he might like to have best been remembered?
Well, there seems to be some argument on that. I do know that in a number of letters and interviews, before Showboat was written, he insisted his favourite show was Rockabye Baby. And it's a lovely, lovely score, totally forgotten. Joyous, puerile melodies because it dealt with babies, real babies, not sugar babies.
Do you have any of that in your collection?
Yes, I have the complete score.
I'd love to hear some of that.
It's charming material.
Before we go, let's play something from that.
Oh.
What do you think's a good example of that show?
Oh, dear. Well, The Lullaby or Little Tune Go Away. I think we'd have to go over the score and you make your own decision on what you like. There's so many lovely tunes in the show.
Okay, we'll choose that later, then we'll back announce it. Right.
Rather you.
Right.
But
okay. No, and I'll come back into it.
After Showboat.
No, I'll lead you into it.
I'm sorry.
Right. That's from a show that Mr. Kern often said was his favourite, called...
called Rockabye Baby. He never said it after Showboat, which tells me something. Now, I have no record of his ever saying that Showboat was his favorite show. His daughter seems to think it was. There seems to be some uncertainty on what his favorite song was. I know one of the songs he loved dearly was one of his last ones, and that was Long Ago.
Beautiful song, yeah.
But quite often he would fight for songs. There was a song that we were not able to find in any of the archives that Robert Russell Bennett told me he kept trying to put into show after show. And Bennett could not remember the melody well enough to transcribe it for me. But, for example, you take Bill. Bill was originally written for Oh Lady Lady in 1918. It was dropped, but Kern was determined to use it. He gave it to Marilyn Miller for Sally, and she couldn't do anything with it. He then gave it to Genevieve Tobin for Dear Sir. She couldn't do anything with it. And luckily, it fit Helen Morgan like a glove, and she did something with it.
I love that tremulous verse in the recording. Little wavery voice.
But in Oh Lady Lady, it opened the show. Well, the second number, after the obligatory chorus opening, O Lady Lady dealt with a young girl named Molly who was to marry a boy named Willoughby. And Molly's mother just can't see why her lovely daughter would marry this boy. And Molly's reply is, well, I used to dream that I would discover the perfect lover. It's a marvelous number. Vivian Siegel said he was cut because it was too slow for the position it was in. Other people have told me it was cut, and Vivian Siegel was one who introduced it in O Lady Lady. Other people say it was cut because it really didn't describe the handsome leading man who played Willoughby. Whatever it was gone before O Lady Lady got to New York.
Mr. Bordman, you have taught music appreciation.
Nope.
No?
No. I'm afraid not.
You have students, don't you?
No.
No, I thought
I'm
you
just
did.
a private scholar.
Right. Okay, right. I want to get into this last question somehow. Right. Mr. Bordman, Gerald Bordman, I couldn't say it any better. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That it needs